I'm really excited to be here today with Professor Eitan Fishbane, who is an associate professor at JTS in Jewish thought and is an author with a particular emphasis on mysticism, Jewish mysticism. So thanks for taking time to talk.
Well, it's my great pleasure, Shmuly.
I've been very eager. I've been a big fan of yours from a distance. Very eager to have the chance to talk with you. And what I'd love to explore for just a short bit today is this wonderful book, The Art of Mystical Narratives, Poetics of the Zohar. This came out last year?
It came out in late December, so it's really...
Oh, this is like hot off the press.
Hot off the press.
Awesome,
Yeah.
Awesome. So I guess the first question I'd ask you is, within Jewish thought, what's the significance of the Zohar?
So really, the Zohar is the great masterpiece of Jewish mysticism, of Kabbalah. But in many ways, it's I really think that we need to see the Zohar as one of the greatest works of religious literature and Jewish religious literature of all time.
Wow.
Really one of the great pillars and classics of Jewish religious tradition, and really has been seen that way throughout the tradition, right, in the sense that it was seen as one of the few works that was really truly sacred and canonical in that way. So it's really stands as one of the masterworks of the tradition.
And then looking beyond the Jewish world, does the Zohar have anything to contribute to mysticism at large beyond Jewish thought?
Absolutely. I mean, so first of all, I mean, the Zohar is really it's as a work of mystical imagination, as a work of mystical poetic creativity. Really is one of the great examples comparatively of the mystical imagination of a way of understanding God that is about uncovering the deepest mysteries of divinity, of the interconnected oneness and unity of all things. Particularly significant about the Zohar, and I developed this a lot in the book, is that a major part of the Zohar involves this tale of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his disciples, reimagined from the vantage point of 13th and 14th century Spanish Jewish Kabbalists who were recreating this world of ancient Galilee. So it's really a fictionalized reimagination of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his disciples wandering about the ancient Galilee in quest of mystical wisdom. And at the heart of that is really the way in which, through their encounter with the world around them, whether it be the natural world, whether it be encountering unexpected strangers on the road who seem to be simpletons and turn out to be great mystical sages, it's through the encounter with this world that the Zohar ultimately leads to its understanding and imagination and exposition of the world of divinity above. Whereas the Zohar says in its Aramaic, Alma tata'a kegavna de alma de la'ela. The world below exists on the model of the world on high, or the divine realm. So that means when the mystics sit under the shade of a beautiful tree overlooking the Sea of Galilee, or when they're walking along the road, or when they encounter a mountain, or they sit in a field together, this leads them to insights about the nature of divinity, right? They sit under the tree, and this leads them to think about the Ilana de Chaye Ila'a, right? The upper tree of life, which is God, right? So everything in this world becomes an association for spiritual insight into the mysteries of divinity, which is really one of these extraordinary features of the Zohar in particular. And the way that it then describes God in this lyrical, mythically explosive and symbolically powerful and gendered and dynamic way opens up a whole new level of the mystical imagination.
So are there deep conflicts of theology within the Zohar, or is it pretty pervasively committed to a panentheism, where God is the outside creator, but also immersed within all of earthly existence?
So it's a really important question, because it varies in the Zohar. I mean, the Zohar is really subscribes to or is an expositor of the Kabbalistic theology that God is made up of these 10 sfirot, these 10 emanations, these 10 dynamic forces of energy, which the Kabbalists will say over and over again. The 10 are really one. The 10 are really one. Right? They insist on that emphasis. So the theology, the vision of God in the Zohar is that of these dynamic flowing forces that are sometimes described as colors, sometimes as almost personified, as gendered, as about the love, the inner divine romance, and so forth. But it's also, and it's about those energies flowing forth from the ultimate fountain of infinity, right? From the ultimate fountain of Ein Sof, right? So I think it's fair to say that for the Kabbalists, and the Zohar as a great example of this, they believe that God was the great force of God is the great force of infinity, of Ein Sofiyut, of Ein Sof, and that overflows into manifestation in the 10 sfirot, which are reflected in our world. And sometimes it's made even more explicit that actually we're all part of that oneness, right? Right. In one case where they're sitting under that tree in the shade in front of the tree, the Sea of Galilee, the son and disciple of Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar, gets up afterwards and he says, Abba ad hashta havina yatve betzila deginta de Eitan. Until now, Abba, Father, until now we were sitting actually under the shade of the Garden of Eden, right? In other words, that this world too is actually part of, and when he means the tree of the Garden of Eden, it's really a part within God, a dimension of God. Yeah. So that means that by experiencing this world, I'm actually experiencing the energy flow of all things. Some Kabbalists really did speak more. Moshe de Leon, who is thought to, for a long time, to have been the only author of the Zohar, and has now shown to be one of the main authors of the Zohar, has another text under his own name in one of his Hebrew works, where he does speak about reality as a kind of great chain of being, right? The way philosophers have sometimes spoken about, right? So that means that everything from the highest reaches of the highest elements of divinity down to the lowest particle of our earthly realm, they're all linked in an inseparable chain, right? And so therefore, and this is key to Kabbalistic theology and for the Zohar, because that means everything that you do in this world has a ripple effect, like you're pulling on the chain, right? So you're affecting the higher realms of divinity through your actions in this world, right? Through your mitzvot, through your kavanot and your thoughts and your intentions, right? All of that has this impact upon the larger divine universe.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I'm struck by is when you talk about sitting under the tree at the Galilee, you think for a moment that the author is there, right? But one of the chapters I loved in here was, actually we're sitting in 13th century Spain, right? And it's an imagination from the diaspora of what it's like to have the mystical encounters within the land. And I think that was incredibly rich for me, of just kind of this mystical imagination from a distance, being in a whole different space. Yeah. Right. You think about time travel, and you think about, but the notion that we exist somewhere fundamentally different. So on this issue of mystical imagination, if I can take a tangent for a pedagogical question, since you're not only a scholar but an educator, how do we cultivate mystical imagination for others, or help others to cultivate that? Meaning, one of the ways I think of education is not merely filling someone's small cup within them, but helping them to expand the size of the cup within them. It's kind of an epistemological question of how do we expand that imagination. Do you have thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the mystical tradition in general, ranging from this time period of Kabbalistic thought through to modern Jewish mysticism or Hasidism and so forth, I think a major piece of this and how this could be applied, right, is how can we expand the theological imagination and help guide others to open their hearts, open their minds, open their souls to the vast possibilities of enriching ideas of faith, right? In other words, that we don't have to be stuck in an older model that might not resonate with many, right? Of the Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, who controls everything. Not that the Kabbalists didn't necessarily also believe in versions of that, but that there are other ways of thinking about God and the presence of God, right? That and particularly the way that the Zohar approaches this worldliness, right? Whether it's through an encounter in the earthiness of the natural world, or whether it's in the face of the other person, right? Which we find a great deal about in the Zohar. The Zohar, the characters will often greet each other and say how wonderful it is to see the face of the Shekhinah, which is an amazing thing, right? It's
that's unbelievable.
That I see the face of God in another person. And this is an extraordinary thing about the Zohar, right?
Sometimes we think of that as a 20th century phenomenon. It's like Buber, it's Levinas, the power of the face, but it's here much earlier.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the insights of Levinas and Buber, or Buber and Levinas, really have that. Really dovetail quite beautifully with what we see there. We see versions of this also in later Kabbalah and Tzfat as well. But the Zohar, I think, at the heart of the Zohar is mystical friendship as well. I mean, I have an essay about this that's going to be coming out in an edited collection over the next year or so. But it's about how is the Zohar? Zohar is about the encounter between mystical friends who open the divine to each other, but it's also very much not. It's not just about the friendship. It's also about the way in which we greet others with certain expectations, right? So particularly in the chapter on narrative ethics, but it's also found elsewhere in the Encounters chapter 2. There's so much that is about. Is the implicit teaching, right? I'm wandering along the road as a Zohar Kabbalist in quest of mystical wisdom, and I encounter somebody, and the characters say, well, this person seems like a simpleton. It seems like this person doesn't have something to teach me about mystical Torah. I got to stay focused on my mystical Torah quest, and then almost predictably, it always is flipped on its head, and they're overwhelmed by the realization that no, this person actually turns out to have deep mystical Torah in them, right? And so the implicit moral lesson is don't assume that you know the depth of every person you encounter, right? Or rather, you should assume that even that divinity and spiritual depth and radiance and revelation is to be found just beneath the surface of every encounter.
How much harder it would be to exploit someone and view the other merely as a tool for instrumental gain. If we could imagine relationships such a way. Why did you choose to read the Zohar as a literary art, and what are the alternatives to making that choice? So for a long time, I think the emphasis in Zohar, the study of the Zohar, was the Zohar as a great example of the history of ideas, the history of Jewish thought, of a mode of theology, of a kind of mystical midrash. Or in quest of the historical groundings and authorship of the Zohar, and these are deep and important questions which continue today with a lot of very important scholarship, or the study of gender and gender symbolism and sexuality and so forth, notion of the body. So these are extremely important questions that have been a part of Zohar scholarship and continue. And then over time there was a turn, I think, and this started with the scholarship of Yehuda Liebes and moved on from there. There really was a turn to appreciating the fact that the Zohar is not just a work of doctrine. It's not just a work of thought and of presenting the ideas about the nature of God and the universe. It is that also, but it's also really about this. It's both about the story of these living characters. These mystics and who have these mystical friendships, are part of this mystical circle of disciples who revere their teacher and their relationship between teachers and disciples.
and how that opens up a kind of literary wonderment, right? So the Zohar, both as a masterpiece of storytelling, of fiction, of narrative, but also as a kind of mystical poetry in the way that it describes God is so lyrical and so and opens us up in the way that poetry has the power to open our imaginations to a realm beyond the way we would ordinarily think about things.
Yeah.
So part of what I try to do in this work is really to utilize and then to adapt and the tools and the methods of literary studies and literary criticism, kind of as the scholar of Jewish thought meets the scholar of literature and literary criticism, right? And because there's a whole range of incredible tools that scholars of literature have developed for how do you read a text as a work of literary art. And so that's what I tried to do in this work, was to try to really develop that and to try to develop an approach that would study the Zohar simultaneously as a work of mystical theology and as a work of literary creativity, poetry, and story.
So, giving up that new potential for creativity, does the poetics of Zohar have anything unique to contribute to normative Judaism when it comes to the halachic worldview or to ethics? You have this wonderful chapter on normative ethics, and I wonder also why, in particular, the points of emphasis were made on forgiveness, hospitality, anger, poverty, and tzedakah. Are those just core ethics for you? Are those the most common themes within? And does your new move of reading this as a literary art open up new potential for how we think about halakha and ethics also?
Fantastic. So first to the question, I guess, of mitzvot and halakha. So it's important for us to remember that the Kabbalists were actually deeply traditional, right? So they took the life of mitzvot and halakha as immensely seriously. These were the grounding elements of their lives. But for them, it was not just about the making sure I'm performing it correctly, but it's very much about kavanah, right? And this kind of goes back to the question that's raised in older sources of, do the mitzvot really need kavanah, right? And there was a debate about this, and the Kabbalists ultimately say that you very much do need a certain kind of kavanah. For them, it's a kind of mystical, spiritual kavanah, that every one of my actions in this world, in the realm of mitzvot, both those that we would call ethics and those that we would call ritual behavior, right, are all they're all part of the way in which our actions in the world have this dramatic effect upon God, right? And when our actions go awry in those realms, that causes an actual rupture and brokenness within divinity, and then
L'shem yichud.
Yeah,
bringing unity.
Right, so exactly. So when we say L'shem yichud kutshabrichu shchinte, right? So that's exactly that point, right? Is saying that for the sake of bringing these parts of God back into alignment as an act of tikkun. This is where the use of tikkun really comes from, is that I'm affecting God in this way. So there's a tremendous amount of attention to the life of mitzvot and of the meaning of the life of mitzvot. Of what am I doing, and how is this reflective of divinity in my actions? And in terms of ethics, right, in the chapter on narrative ethics, this part of what I tried to do there, and certainly there are other virtues that we could notice in the Zohar. I think these were some of the dominant ones that I noticed in looking at a lot of the sources. Is how does the Zohar's storytelling, how does its construction of narrative function the way literary scholars have noticed that other works of literature can convey moral lessons in powerfully evocative ways, right? The philosopher Martha Nussbaum had a very big impact on me in this way, in the sense that in some ways right, the work of art, and particularly the dramatic work of art, or the narrative dramatic work of art, and I try to characterize the Zohar as a work of dramatic literature, because it's so performative and so theatrical, has the power, that work of art has the power, actually, when done right, to evoke a sense of love and compassion,
empathy,
and kindness and empathy being like the driving force of it, exactly. In a way that, let's say, analytical philosophy would have a harder time doing, right? In other words, that you think about the times that you've been moved, right, by seeing film in particular, right, as a great example of that, right? Why is that so, right? It's because it pulls you into an ability to imagine yourself inside that other person's feeling.
Oh, and it trusts that you will engage in reflective journey.
Yes.
Because if it just spells it out, it doesn't need to really trust that you're going to do that.
Yeah.
This sort of imagines not necessarily an elite readership, but those who will bring intentionality to what they're doing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And so one of the interesting examples that I love in that chapter is a text that is really one of the primary texts from where this idea of the ushpizin in the sukkah comes from, which is that this character Hamnuna Sava, it says he would stand in the entrance to the sukkah and he would say, "Come sit, heavenly guests," right? And when he's talking about the Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and so on and so forth, he's really talking about these divine dimensions that are symbolized by those, come dwell into this space. And it's a kind of mystical moment of bringing God into the sukkah, right? But then also says, very explicitly, right, if you... it's almost like it's almost a sacrificial feeding of God, because it then says that you should then invite the poor person in need, right? Not just necessarily your friend to come be your guest in your sukkah, right? But it was specifically about bring the vulnerable into your sukkah and feed them, right, and sustain them in a dignified way, and that is the feeding of God. I mean, that is a very powerful statement. Essentially, that the poor person, the vulnerable person, the person who's hungry, is an embodiment of divinity, is an embodiment of God in that moment, right? And you're supposed to give them the portion for these heavenly guests, right? Which is an amazing idea, right? And it says there also that, right, if you quoting a verse I believe is in Malachi, right, and the Rambam also speaks about this, right? If you sit and enjoy your meal and you don't also care for the person's hungry. Exactly, right. Then it's just you're just
joy of the stomach.
Then you're just enjoying your exactly. And then it will be a kind of ugly moment, right, or a crass moment. And the way that he says that is, and the way the Zohar says it, or in the voice of Hamnuna Saba, is then if you do that, then the heavenly guests say, "I'm out of here. Forget it. All right, I don't want to be here if you're not going to care for the poor, the hungry, the vulnerable, who are essentially my embodiment in the world." Right? There's the play between this and Christian notions of Christ as embodied in poverty is can't be ignored, and I talk about that in the book too. There's some because these Zohar Kabbalists were also living in a world that was heavily influenced by that kind of preaching, but they really say it in a deeply Jewish way.
And you might have thought in that conflation of the spiritual and physical that we would, as some mystics certainly do, deny suffering as a problem. Right? But it seems part of the conclusion there is that we need to feed these people. Right? That their vulnerability, their suffering matters, and so, I don't know if they go to the extent that God is suffering to some degree. Are we alleviating divine suffering through that act?
I think that that's definitely gestured out there, and I think that it certainly could be adapted in that way in very powerful ways. I think that it's that the poor person in that sense, right, or the vulnerable person is associated with Shekhinah in the Kabbalistic theology, right? The Shekhinah is the one who doesn't have a light of her own, but she receives light overflow from the other Sfirot, right? So it's kind of a sense, or she is the broken one, right? So a sense that the person who's in a state of brokenness in this physical life is actually a living physical embodiment of a divine brokenness, right? And so therefore, by caring for the person who's broken in our world, we are we are quite literally bringing greater wholeness to God's brokenness,
Yeah.
right? And I think if that is true, I think that is a fair reading of Kabbalistic thinking.
So I've got 20 more questions to ask you, but in the interest of time, we'll end on this last one of what has this meant for you personally? It's a remarkable contribution, and as someone who's somewhat of a novice, not even appreciating the depth of what's offered here. But what has this meant to you personally to engage in this work?
Well, I mean, in addition to the fact that these sources have always moved me spiritually, personally, theologically as well, and that continues to be the case, I think, and that it conveys very meaningful, relevant ideas like we were just talking about the relationship between morality and moral responsibility and spiritual life. It's also, this book really represents in some ways kind of the culmination of my adult life studying the Zohar, right from the time I was 18 years old as a freshman at Brandeis and studying poetry and also studying Kabbalah and for a long time really having these twin interests, right, both in poetry and in storytelling or literary creativity on the one hand, and mystical imagination and spiritual theology and spiritual life on the other, and so this book is a kind of confluence of those two things, right? These two things that have always lived deeply inside of me, and continues to be the case. I'm still deeply drawn to poetry and literature more broadly. At the same time that I'm drawn to Jewish mysticism and mysticism of other religions as well. So this like brings those together in a very both intellectually for me and also in terms of my own inner life.
Amazing. Dr. Eitan Fishbane is just a wonderful scholar and a delightful mensch. And check out The Art of Mystical Narrative, Poetics of the Zohar. If you're considering an education at JTS, among the amazing faculty there, Dr. Fishbane is a good enough reason himself to attend there as a scholar and teacher. So thank you so much for this precious time.
My pleasure. Thank you.